Raise your hand. Who of you uses open source projects? I think that's literally everyone. Who of you submitted an issue or pull request to open source projects they use? It's awesome. Also, almost everyone. And who of you started their own open source project or maintains one? Still like almost half the room. It's impressive. Cool. Thanks, everybody. So I'm Felix Krause, the creator of Fastlane, which is an open source tool that automates all the tedious tasks of iOS and Android developments, like dealing with localized screenshots, dealing with code signing, uploading all these things, and so on. So today I don't want to talk about Fastlane, but about about scaling open source communities around Fastlane. So I was lucky enough to grow a small side project of mine into a tool that is now part of Google, with over 13,000 commits and 15,000 stars on GitHub. Fastlane is actively being developed by over 600 external contributors and was recently named as one of the most active open source projects on GitHub. So in this talk, I want to share some of the things I learned when scaling the project from 0 to tens of thousands of active users. In general, you can categorize open source projects into 4 stages. When you put out some source code on GitHub or any other code hosting platform, you start at stage 1. That means you just publish the source code. It doesn't mean that your project is used anywhere outside of your own project yet. And stage 2 is when other developers suddenly start using your project. And this is a really cool feeling, because someone somewhere on the world you don't know suddenly uses your software. Like they took the time to read through it, set it up, and start using it. Stage number 3 is even cooler. That's when your software becomes the go-to solution in its field. And you might realize that for the first time when people start blogging about it or recommending your software on Twitter. And that's a really good feeling. And what's not as cool is stage 4, which is when your project becomes really, really popular and suddenly you get hundreds of notifications on GitHub every day. It's really hard to actually deal with support and help people. There will be blog posts that start attacking your project and saying bad things about it. And there might even be commercial versions built on top of it or using it. So I was lucky enough to go through all these stages with Fastlane, and I learned a lot over the last 2 years, but not so much about like coding or design patterns, but more about the human factor of open source. Things like how to enable contributors to have the best impact, how to handle support for large-scale open source projects, and how to interact with other developers on GitHub. So first I want to talk quickly about some of the problems you will face, and the second part of the presentation will be all about solutions you can apply to your own project. So let's start with the project momentum. The bigger your project becomes, the harder it is to keep the innovation you had in the beginning. Suddenly you have to consider hundreds of use cases and thousands of production setups. So you cannot just, remove an option or change a parameter name or even change a default value. So this really slows you down during development. And another big part of this is handling support. So you will soon realize that helping your users will take much, much more time than actually working on your project. And the graph you can see up there shows that I spend twice as much time on GitHub issues, than I actually spent in my text editor. And people submit all kinds of issues. Many of them aren't actually issues, but they're feature requests or questions. So the way you receive feature requests is really important. You can use GitHub issues to receive feature requests. So people submit an issue and you would label them accordingly. And so people can comment on it, upvote it, and so on. You could also use a separate website where people can submit ideas and other people can upvote it. Or you say you want to feature freeze your project altogether and don't allow any new features at all. And in general, all features have to align with the project vision. So you as a project maintainer have to have a way to turn down a feature idea if you don't agree with it. And why is that important? Well, with Fastlane, very often the following happened. I think I have to walk somewhere else. So we would get an issue that tells us, well, it's really annoying. Every time I get up in the morning, I have to make my own coffee. And it would be so cool if Fastlane made that for me. And yeah, it sounds like a really cool idea. But I would comment that this doesn't fit into the Fastlane vision. Like, this is not what we set out to build Fastlane for. So I would comment that and close the issue. And can you guess what happens next? Well, we get this comment being like, well, I got up this morning. There was no coffee on my table. Why is this issue closed? It's obviously not fixed yet. So this actually happens a lot. This is no joke. It was not so much about coffee, though. And very similarly to issues and feature ideas, you also have to decide what pull requests to merge and which to reject. Because once a change is merged into your code base, you have to support and test it in all future releases. And if the feature breaks one day in the future, very often you will be the one who has to fix it. And in general, reviewing and testing pull requests takes almost as much time as writing a code for it. That's something many people don't consider. And another interesting phenomenon that happens on some bigger open source projects is that maintainers stop being the users of their own software. So someone set out to build this open source project, and suddenly it became successful, and they start working full-time on it. With that, they stop the activity they've been doing before. So for me, that was iOS development. And that means you don't actually use the product on a day-to-day basis anymore. And this is actually really challenging. So you need to find a way to still somehow use your product. So you can either start a side project where you use it, or you can try to use it for your own project. So for example, we deploy Fastlane using Fastlane, which means everybody who works on the code base also works with Fastlane. And if that's not possible for your project, at least go through the onboarding from time to time to make sure everything's solid and the documentation is very clear. And there is a very big information imbalance between the project maintainer and the users. So for you as a maintainer, an issue is just another issue. But for the user, this issue is everything. This issue is 100% of the interaction they have with your project. And it's something they will remember for a long time. So this first hit me when I attended WWDC last year, and people would come up to me and say, yeah, so we talked on this one issue about something. And they assumed that I would know the whole context needed to actually help on that. And so for you as a maintainer, the GitHub issue is an issue that has to be prioritized. So it might not be the most important thing for you right now. But for the user, this issue is everything, and it might actually keep them from using your product. So another more interesting part of the presentation on how to actually scale open source projects. And with Fastlane, we've tried many different approaches, and we're still learning and experimenting a lot. But we already found some really good solutions you can easily apply to your own project. First off, improve your error messages. No matter how good your software actually is, you will always run into unexpected situations. So the way you show error messages and crashes is very, very important. I'm going to show you 2 error messages that are the same error, but they're shown differently. This is how we've used to show Fastlane error messages. It would print out the complete stack trace and all kinds of debug information. Because back then I thought, well, the more information I show, the easier it is for people to debug. It's not the case. So we fixed it, and it now looks like this. So it's very clear on what the actual message is. And in combination with that, we also want to make it as easy as possible for people to actually fix the problem. So we would print out links to Stack Overflow. We would print out commands that allow you to reproduce the error. And we would show you all information you need, like the certificate ID and certificate name, so you can debug the issue on your own. And once you have great error messages, the next step is to make it as easy as possible to find similar issues so that they can easily join the discussion. So basically, when you receive any cryptic error message, what is the first thing you do? Usually, you would copy it and Google it or search on GitHub. So you have to make it easy for people to find existing issues. Ideally, they would see the issues right when the error happens, and you can actually do that. So Otta built this cool thing called GH Inspector that will take the error message and search GitHub issues for similar issues. So you can then directly click on the link and read all the discussion around how to fix it. And if the user doesn't find any existing issues, chances are high they submit an issue on GitHub. So it's very important to properly manage those. And I'm not a big fan of bots. Usually I'm very annoyed by them. But once you reach a certain scale, you kind of need to have some kind of automated response system. Otherwise, it's just too much time you have to spend on support. So in this section, I want to quickly show some of the most important things you can set up. And all the bot features I mentioned now are also, just like Fastlane, completely open source under the MIT license. So you can also use that for your projects. When you submit an issue, providing all information that's necessary to debug the issue is really, really hard, even for us as software engineers. So GitHub recently introduced the issuetemplate.md document that would pre-fill the new issue form with a given text. The problem is, and GitHub probably didn't think of that, is that most people just delete it and write their own issue. So very often this would happen. People would submit an issue with a one-sentence description of what's wrong, and a lot of key information is missing, like what Fastlane version do they run? Do they use plugins? And did they upgrade the OpenSSL version? So using the Fastlane bot, we ensure that all required information is available. So if that's not the case, the bot would tell the user it's not included, and please run the Fastlane env command, which would prepare all the information we need to debug an issue. So you would run that on your local machine and would generate this markdown, which very nicely provides all information we need. And this is similar to what CocoaPods also does with podenv. And so if you receive similar issues very often, you should always step back and fix the underlying issue. However, sometimes that's not possible. And for us, that's code signing. Like, there is only so much things we can do. So we wrote a very long guide on how to set up code signing, how to troubleshoot code signing issues, and so on. But turns out most people don't really like reading the documentation. So unless you point them to the right spot, which is what the Fastlane bot does. So the Fastlane bot would detect, oh, this might be related to code signing, and it would just link to the code signing guide. What you should consider is that for every 10 issues you get about a certain topic, there's probably hundreds of other people who ran into the same issue, but didn't take the time to submit one. And the key to handling large-scale support is always to keep issues moving. You have to avoid having issues stall. So for those of you who are iOS developers, who is an iOS developer in the room? What is the ratio? Okay, a large part. So as iOS developers, we all know that when you submit a radar, it can be really frustrating, right? You don't hear back for like 2 years, and then Apple tells you, oh, have you tried it with Xcode 10? And then you would probably have no way to actually reproduce the issue, right? And it's the same thing for open source projects. So sometimes you would try something, you would run into an issue, file an issue, and then you go with a different solution. Or maybe you already found a workaround and you don't actually care about spending more time. Or maybe you just switched company and teams and you don't actually have access to the source code anymore. So having a bot can ensure that all issues are still relevant and reproducible with the most recent release. For Fastlane, when an issue has no activity for 2 months, the Fastlane bot will ask if the issue is still relevant with the most recent release. And if no one replies to that within a month, the issue gets auto-closed with a note that a new issue can be submitted. And about a month after closing the issue, the bot would even go ahead and lock the conversation so that no one can comment on it anymore. Which brings me to the next topic. Locking all resolved and inactive issues is a great way to avoid resurfacing of issues from previous Fastlane releases. In Fastlane, we experienced that people would comment on issues that kind of sound similar, but they're actually not related at all. Or sometimes people would comment on issues that have hundreds of subscribers, triggering unwanted email notifications for people who already found the solution. And of course, the very famous Me Too comments that add no value to the discussion, and of course, again, spams people. So by telling users to submit a new issue, you properly go through the complete life cycle of an issue again. First, the user submits an issue. The bot ensures that all relevant information is there. Then the actual discussion happens around the issue. And in the end, the issue either gets auto-closed or it gets resolved. So with all these bot features, how much did it actually help for the Fastlane project? By just introducing those few bot features, we reduced the number of open issues and PRs dramatically. We went from over 700 open tickets to less than 300, and we stayed there for the last 8 months. And until now, we mostly covered issues, but the very relevant part is also responding to pull requests. And your continuous integration service already verifies that all your tests pass and that your code style follows your convention. However, UCI doesn't ensure the way how changes are introduced. That's why Orta and I started out to build Danger, a Ruby gem that allows you to define rules for pull requests. So you can do things like, hey, if this file gets modified, show a warning on GitHub, because usually we don't want to modify this file. Or if there is like 10 new lines of code, there must be at least one newly added test. And Danger also helps with this very interesting phenomenon called PR and runs. And this is something you can see across all open source projects. Someone takes the time to prepare a pull request, submit it, and then a few minutes later the tests fail. And then for some reason, the author doesn't update the PR to fix the tests. The reason for that is that GitHub doesn't send out an email that the tests have failed. So the author just doesn't know about it. So now you as a project maintainer have to go ahead and tell the author to fix the tests. And this is of course something that should be completely automated. Like you don't want to spend time on doing this manually. And by using Danger, you can actually have the CI post the test results on GitHub, triggering an email notification to the author and tell them how to fix the tests. And it's very, very important to work into the same direction and have a shared vision. And it's a little harder with open source projects because instead of having meetings, everything runs asynchronously. So many bigger open source projects introduced a vision.md document that describes the higher level goals and the general philosophy of a project. By having that, you can say no to pull requests or issues by referencing the written agreement on the repo. And the beauty of this is that everyone actually has the chance to propose changes in the policy by submitting a pull request to this vision.md document. As your user base grows, you want to get more people joining you on maintaining your project and pushing it forward. You want to increase the number of people having commit access to your project and that are familiar with the code base. So one thing you should do very early on is add a code of conduct to your project. It is very important that all developers feel safe and unsafe environment. You should also make it very easy for people to get started coding on your project. So onboarding should be really smooth. And if you're not on a mono repo, you should provide scripts that set up all the development dependencies so people can get started coding really fast. And this is something many open source projects don't consider. Keep the code base simple. The more complex your software architecture is, the more difficult it is for people to get started coding, and less people are able to contribute. Instead of using the latest Swift magic to save like 4 lines of code, use the easiest to understand technique to solve a certain problem. This makes it easier for people to spot issues and contribute to your project. And of course, be welcoming and friendly to new contributors. Thank people for submitting issues. Thank people for submitting PRs. And always ask for help or clarification if needed. When scaling your open source project, you have to say no to a lot of things. And this can be really frustrating sometimes. So you want to still enable your project to grow. And you can implement various ways for the users to extend your software. And one thing is a domain-specific language, a DSL. So many Ruby-based open source projects offer a DSL to implement a very dynamic configuration. So projects like Fastlane, CocoaBots, and Bundler offer a gem file, pod file, and a fast file. And instead of having static values, like it is the case for JSON or YAML files, you can actually execute code in those files. This is extremely useful to fetch and generate values on demand. Here is an example Ruby DSL that shows that you can pass static values, like the custom name string, You can pass closures, like the file.read, and you can even run external code or fetch data from remote web services. So this is a really cool first approach. But still, you want to have people extend your project, not just have a very dynamic configuration. So you have to allow developers to extend your project without having to touch the code base. For Fastlane, many people needed integrations to a third-party service, but they didn't want to touch the main code base. So you can implement something called local extensions or local actions, where people would basically build their own integrations. And this works great for a while, until developers want to share their integrations with fellow developers. And once that's the case, you need to provide an ecosystem to share integrations between developers. And you can do that in the form of plugins. And while it's not always possible for all kinds of setups to build a plugin architecture, it enables your project to advance at a much faster pace. It will keep your code base simpler, it will reduce the dependency graph, and you might receive less PRs and issues adding new features you maybe don't want. And most platforms already have a great dependency manager available, like, for example, the Swift Package Manager, or for Ruby, it's RubyGems and Bundler. So at Fastlane, we use RubyGems and Bundler, which enables people to very easily distribute and use plugins. And as a result, just within the last half year, there's already 160 third-party plugins available. So scaling open source projects is really hard, and there's a lot of challenges you will face as your project grows. But ideally, you're not the only person having to solve those issues, but you have contributors helping you. If you're ever stuck on something or don't know where to go, ask the community for help. Without the amazing Fastlane community, it would never be where it is now. Good open source projects stay alive for a really, really long time, and you can have an enormous impact on developers and companies around the world. Even if maintaining open source projects can be hard and tricky sometimes, there is nothing more rewarding on seeing how your project is being used by fellow developers. And if you have any other ideas on how to make open source better for both sides, please come say hi after my talk. I would love to learn more. Thank you.